ladies and gentlemen. It is my great privilege and honor to welcome you here this evening. My name is Ken Burtis. I'm Dean of the College of Biological Sciences, and I am pleased to welcome you to this very special event sponsored by the Storrs Endowment for the Life Sciences and co-sponsored by the Newman Center in Davis. This is an unusual event for us. It's something that wouldn't have happened without our good friends, particularly Father Jack Izzo here in the front row from the Newman Center, and we are very pleased and privileged to have tonight's speaker with us. I would like to now introduce my colleague from the Department of Plant Sciences, Professor Ken Shackle, who's going to introduce this evening's speaker.
Thank you, Ken. My name is Ken Shackle, and I'm introducing Ken Miller, so I guess it's Ken Cube time or something. We're delighted that the Newman Center and the Storr Lectureship could jointly sponsor a visiting scholar of the stature of Dr. Miller. Even though I've only had a short time to meet with him, I feel like, well, he's a very personable guy, and I'm sure that by the end of this evening you'll see why I say that. Dr. Miller has the usual credentials of undergraduate and PhD and so on in biology, but I don't like long introductions, so I'm not going to give one. But I think that one of the things that I'm most envious about was that he appeared on the Colbert Report. As far as I know, he was the first scientist to ever invoke the Steve Martin theory of evolution, and maybe we'll hear about that tonight. But he's going to talk to us about God, Darwin, and design, and I'm not sure why the projector's not projecting here. Faith and certainty in the scientific world, so please join me in welcoming Ken Miller.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you. I'm a little puzzled, too, as to what just happened. Computer's fine, screen went dead. Exactly, that's right. It's not like it's a no signal. It's well. Let me try to go ahead and start and tell you what you would be seeing up here. First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming. I'd like to thank the Foundation, the Newman Center, and UC Davis especially for having me. It was a very fortunate set of circumstances that I found myself coming to the Bay Area. And therefore, it was very easy for me to call up Father Jack and say, yes, I can come to Davis, and I appreciate everyone who made all of these things possible. The first slide I wanted to show was a picture of me in my laboratory. I'm a cell biologist. I work on the structure and function of biological membranes. My major research tool is the electron microscope, and I publish in journals like Cell and the Journal of Cell Biology. Oh, there we are. Okay, that's cool. Thanks very much. So this is the slide I wanted to show you. And there I am. And I always get nervous in front of an audience like this. I like to tell people I have three jobs. The first one is that of a researcher. Let's see, now why am I getting a little, that's peculiar. Oh, it doesn't, oh, the lamp is not happy. Ah, okay. The second one is the job that many people in this auditorium have, or will have after you complete your undergraduate work, which is that I'm a teacher. I'm lucky enough that I have a colleague who's lecturing in my freshman biology class tomorrow. In the spring term, I teach the largest course at my university, which is a general biology course. And these are not my students, these are my teaching assistants. So that'll give you some idea as to the size of the course. But the reason I said I get nervous in front of a large crowd of undergraduates is because a lot of you probably already know me, and you may not like me. And the reason for that is if when you were in high school, you used any of those books for high school biology, I wrote them. And therefore, I want to apologize in advance for your sort of aching backpack and pains and aches and other sorts of things. A few years ago, I also wrote a book on evolution and religion, which is called Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution. This book is coming out this month in a new edition, which has some additional material at the end about the Dover trial I was involved in, and I'll tell you all about it. And let it suffice to say that I thought this would be a nice little book. Mom and Dad would get a copy. It looked nice on my CV. My department chairman would be impressed. But to my astonishment, addressing this topic, evolution and religion, has hit a very responsive chord among a lot of people. And this book has actually gone through 25 printings in paperback. And I get letters and emails and inquiries about it all the time. And it's made me appreciate something. And that is that people really hunger for some sort of explanation of science that deals with religious issues in one way or another. Now, in a sense, the theme of what I want to talk about tonight is this. And that is that we live in interesting times. And if you want to know how interesting the times are, it was only a few years ago when a school board in Georgia, Cobb County, Georgia, bought new biology textbooks for about 3,000 students in their 17 high schools. Cobb County is not Podunkville. It is the second largest school district in the state of Georgia. It's a large, prosperous urban area. But they also decided that the book that they had purchased was so dangerous that it required a warning label to be pasted inside the book to warn students that evolution was just a theory, not a fact. And if you wonder, gee, I wonder what book it was that was so dangerous that it needed a warning label, that's the book. That's right, it was our book. And this is what the warning label said. And the label said, this textbook has material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, about the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered. And when that sticker went on my book, I was called up by a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And she started the conversation by saying, Dr. Miller, aren't you outraged by that sticker they put on your book? And I thought that was a strange thing to say. Strange way to start an interview. I thought, well, what is she doing? And then I realized I think she might be trolling for an inflammatory quote. Perhaps she'd like to write an article that says, author incensed at Board of Education, or author, or better yet, Northern author outraged at Board of Education. So I decided I would not let her have the satisfaction. And I said, no, I like the stickers. She said, you do? I said, I think the stickers are great. They just don't go far enough. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, yeah, the book has material on evolution. It's got material on a lot of stuff. That's true. Evolution is a theory. She said, is evolution a theory? I said, absolutely. Chapter 15 of that book is called Darwin's Theory of Evolution. There's no argument about that. But when you say evolution is a theory, not a fact, that gives a false impression. Theories and facts are not opposites. And she said, give me an example. And I said, well, let's suppose a young person went to the University of Georgia to study physics. They'd have to take courses in atomic theory. Why do we call those courses atomic theory? Is it because, like we're not really sure of atoms? And maybe someday if we get really sure, we'll change the names of the courses to atomic facts? Well, I don't think so. The reason we call atomic theory what we do is because atomic theory explains hundreds of thousands of observational experimental facts about the nature of matter. That's exactly what evolutionary theory does. Theories in science never become facts. Theories in science explain facts, and that's the key. But I said the sentence that really bugs me is actually the third one. And she looked at that and she said, are you against having an open mind? And I said, no, read that like a 14-year-old. You know what that says to a 14-year-old? That says we are certain of every single thing in this book except for one topic. And that one topic is evolution, and evolution's a little shaky. So she said, so you object to that as an evolutionist? I said, no, I object to that as a cell biologist, because it tells students you don't need an open mind to study cell biology. You don't have to study carefully to study biochemistry. And you don't need critical analysis to study ecology. And I said, look, the reality is you need those things for everything. So I tell you what I'll do. No charge. I will rewrite the sticker for Cobb County. So here's my proposed rewrite of the sticker. And that is, this textbook has material on science. Science is built around theories which are strongly supported by factual evidence. Everything in science should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered. and that's a sticker I'd be very happy to put on the book myself. Alas, they didn't listen. They didn't take me up on the offer. They went to court. They lost. The stickers had to come out. It kicked around a little bit at the appeals level at the federal court. I had the pleasure of testifying in that trial. And when the trial was over and we won the verdict, I was called up by a reporter for the Associated Press, and like a fool, I talked to her, not appreciating that when you talk to an Associated Press reporter the next morning, your name will be in the first line of a story that appears in 1,200 newspapers, which turned out to be true. And the day that that appeared, I got more "you're gonna burn in hell" email than I've ever got in my life. It told me as much as anything else what the stakes of this battle were. And I should add that now this is a final decision because the Cobb school board has agreed to a consent decree in which they will never have stickers like this go back into textbooks. So that was a bit of a victory. What happens, and the point that I want to make, is that evolution is a national issue. In the summer of 2005, Time magazine did a cover story on this. They called this the Evolution Wars. They talked about how many Americans reject the theory of evolution. They pointed out that our president has spoken out on this issue, not always helpfully, in the view of an awful lot of us in science. Although I hope you appreciate this. My textbook co-author is named Joe Levine. And Joe and I couldn't stop laughing when we saw which textbook they had superimposed President Bush's face on in this particular story. That's our book. And there were a couple reasons for that. One is, we're always looking for new cover art for our book. And this could be it. And we actually have to go, in 2 years from now, Texas is going to have a statewide textbook adoption. And that may just be the cover that is going to sell us books in Texas. You never know. But to point out this national issue, in the last 2 years, there have been major federal court cases on the teaching of evolution in 2 states. Georgia, I just mentioned, and Pennsylvania, which I'll tell you about in a moment. In November, just a couple months ago, statewide elections in 2 other states turned on the issue of evolution. And these other 2 states were Kansas and Ohio. Now you might wonder, what does a statewide election on evolution actually look like? Well, in each case, these were elections for the State Board of Education. And in Ohio, here is the way in which this was covered. This is the Sunday Plain Dealer, Cleveland Plain Dealer, largest newspaper in Ohio, 10 days before the election. And on the front page, they said, normally low-profile contest in Spotlight. That was the contest for the State Board of Education. The Cleveland district was represented by a marketing professor, University of Akron, named Deborah Owens Fink. And Ms. Fink had been the leader of the anti-evolution or the creationist forces. And she was opposed by someone who was pro-science and pro-evolution with the very memorable name of Tom Sawyer. That looked, you can't make this stuff up. It looked very good on the ballot. And this was widely discussed. And what was the level of discourse? Well, a talk show host in Cleveland discussing the pluses and minuses of the 2 candidates put it this way. And what he said on the air, reported in the papers, if you believe in God, creation, and true science, vote for Debbie. If you believe in evolution, abortion, and sin, vote for her opponents. Now, I've seen a lot of analysis of the November election, but I haven't seen anybody yet break down the sin vote. But it turns out that apparently, at least in Ohio, the sin vote did pretty well because pro-evolution candidates swept the Board of Education in Ohio. So for anyone who doubts that the American people can make the appropriate choice when the scientific and the educational communities put the facts in front of them, pay attention to the elections last year in Ohio, and for that matter, to the elections in Kansas, where pro-evolution candidates also took over the State Board of Education. Democracy works. It may take some time, but democracy does indeed work. Nationally, however, there's something to be learned from this. Only a small number of states actually have state public school education standards that actually treat the theory of evolution well. Fortunately, California is one of those states. But I like to show this map to people in my part of the country up in New England, where we think everything up here is just fine, and point out to them that 3 of the actual worst states in the country in terms of science standards for the teaching of evolution are actually in New England: Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine. So anyone who thinks this is a regional problem, in other words, Alabama, Mississippi, and that's it, is not paying attention to what's happening on a national level, and that's the issue. Now why is evolution an issue? And I think that's a fair question. Why is evolution under attack? A lot of people would say it's because it's a shaky scientific theory. But I actually don't think so. This is a booklet published by an organization called Answers in Genesis. These are the guys who are building the Creation Museum in Kentucky. It's going to open in just a couple of weeks. They spent $27 million on this museum. This is the largest anti-evolution organization in the country. They depict evolution as the apple in the mouth of the serpent. In other words, as the ultimate lie. Now, why is evolution under attack? In other words, biology, think about this, is a discipline with a lot of subfields. Why would you single out evolution to be taken out of the curriculum? You could take something else out. Why not take out cell biology? Why not take out physiology? For God's sakes, why not take out organic chemistry? There are lots of possibilities here. I apologize in advance, by the way, to all the chemistry faculty in the room. I know it's a cheap shot. I'm sorry about that. If you want to know why, these guys will tell you why. At their website, they depict evolution not as being shaky, but as the rock-solid foundation of everything they think is wrong with society. Lawlessness, homosexuality, pornography, and abortion. Now, if that's not graphic enough for you, it might not be. Here's another graphic, same guys, depicting what they think is going on in the country right now. What they think is happening is a war between evolution and creation. The name of the founder of evolution is right there. That's not Darwin, folks. Looks close. Creation is on this side. Evolution flies the flag of humanism. Creation flies the flag of Christianity. Evidently, if you're Jewish, there's no place for you in this fight. The fruits of evolution include divorce, pornography, racism, abortion, and so forth. Now, I like this cartoon, and I show it not to make fun of these guys, but to make a very serious point. A lot of my scientific colleagues who know that I have been involved in fighting these guys will come to me and say, hey, Ken, what would convince them? How about if we showed them this fossil? Or how about you tell them about this experiment? Wouldn't that convince them? They say that because they think this is an ordinary scientific argument, that it's on the basis of evidence, the way that arguments in science always are. These are the guys for whom I open my drawer and I say, take a look at this. If you really think that evolution is the root of all of these things, no fossil, no experiment, no piece of evidence is going to convince you that evolution is right. This isn't a scientific argument. It's a war about culture and it's a war about values. And that's important to understand. Now, this next manifestation of this war, a couple years ago, 2004, was in Dover, Pennsylvania. Unlike Cobb County, Dover is a really small town. They voted in their school board to instruct the biology teachers in Dover to prepare an intelligent design curriculum. And this was the scoreboard outside Dover High School the day after they voted. Intelligent design won, Darwin nothing. I love that when I saw that because as an old baseball player, I realized that it doesn't hurt to let the visiting team get a couple runs up early in the game as long as you get to bat in the bottom of the ninth. And as you'll see in a second, we got to bat in the bottom of the ninth. Now what happened is this caused tremendous dissension in the community. And many people in the community objected to this. The teachers, the biology teachers in Dover, and there's only 4 of them, this really is a small town, at the risk of losing their jobs, refused to prepare this curriculum. They refused even to read a statement that the school board wrote for them. And instead, the school board sent the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, into the biology classes to read a statement on evolution while the teacher stood outside in the hallway. The next morning, 11 parents filed a lawsuit against the Dover board, arguing that their First Amendment rights as Americans had been infringed upon, because the First Amendment guarantees that the state will not establish a religion. And they argued this intelligent design thing was, in fact, a religion. A trial ensued. There were expert witnesses on both sides. This guy is Rob Pennock, Michigan State, philosopher of science. His testimony was critical to us, and I had the honor, if that's the right word, of being the lead witness for the plaintiffs in the trial. I ended up spending 2 days on the stand leading off the trial. The trial was an extraordinary event. It's like nothing I've ever participated in my life, and it went on for 7 weeks. At the end of 7 weeks, it ended the end of October 2005, Dover had a school board election. Now, in trials like this, the judge doesn't rule at the end of the trial. The judge takes a long time to rule because he has to write an opinion that might be more than 100 pages in length. But the trial was over. No one knew what the judge's decision would be, but Dover had a school board election. And the citizens of Dover saw what had happened in the trial and the way in which the machinations of their school board had been exposed, and they voted the entire Board of Education out of office. So that board, by the time the decision came out, was already gone. Then, 6 weeks after the vote, the judge ruled. And the result of his ruling was a stinging rebuke to this idea of intelligent design, or the idea of an intelligent designer. The decision is known as Kitzmiller v. Dover. K-I-T-Z Miller versus Dover. The lead plaintiff was named Tammy Kitzmiller. And I'd urge all of you to get a copy of it. And it's really easy to get. Just type the word Kitzmiller into Google, and the first thing that will come up is the decision. Now, it's 137 pages long, but don't worry, it's double-spaced, so it's easy to read. And the other thing is, the reason I recommend you get it, there are actually two. One is, it is written in incredibly plain English. There's no legalese. It is extremely easy to understand. And the second thing is, parts of it are literally laugh-out-loud funny. You will not believe some of the stuff that happened in this courtroom that is related in the judge's decision. Now, I think we can learn a couple of things from the trial. This, by the way, is the NBC courtroom sketch of me on the stand being cross-examined by attorneys for the other side. This is the somewhat more caricaturish New Yorker cartoon of Michael Behe, one of the expert witnesses for the other side, being examined by one of our attorneys. And I would say that we can learn a couple things from the trial. Here's the first thing, and that is the trial demonstrated what I would characterize as the complete collapse of intelligent design as anything resembling a scientific theory. And I want to explain in a couple of cases what I mean by that. There were favorite examples that the intelligent design folk brought forth. They argued that things like the bacterial flagellum are too complicated to have evolved and must have been created by an intelligent designer, or the blood clotting pathway, or they charged that evolution couldn't generate biological information. Every one of these we were able to show was simply incorrect. But I want to give you two concrete examples. One often hears people argue that evolution couldn't be true because the fossil record doesn't have the right fossils. It doesn't have intermediate forms. It doesn't show transitional forms in the fossil record. Well, a few years ago, the National Academy of Sciences tried to address that. And look at what the National Academy said. They said, look, there's so many intermediate forms between fish and amphibians, reptiles, even along the primate lines of descent, that it's often difficult to identify where the transition occurs from one species to another. That's the very definition of a transitional form, is you can't tell where one species ends and the other one leaves off. But that's just a quotation. In the trial, we wanted to make sure that people saw exactly what was going on. So Kevin Padian from the University of California at Berkeley was another of our expert witnesses. And here's one of the things that Kevin talked about. He talked about the evolution of whales and dolphins, cetaceans. Now, we've known for a long time that whales and dolphins evolved from terrestrial mammals. We've known it happened about 50, 60, 70 million years ago. And the oldest known fossil whales are unmistakable intermediate forms. They have pelvic girdles, they have teeth that look like land animals and everything else. But critics of evolution have always said, oh yeah, if that's true, where are the intermediates? If you want us to believe evolution, you ought to find a whole series of intermediates between these. And some critics of evolution have even said that the whole notion that you could have an animal that was intermediate between the land and the water is ridiculous. An animal like that would be too awkward to survive on land and would be too poor a swimmer to survive in the water. So it's even ridiculous to assume that there could have been an intermediate form. Well, they said that up until about, 15 years ago, when paleontologists began to dig up fossils that look remarkably like the animals they had said could never possibly have existed. And this is one of these fossils. It was discovered in the Indus River Valley between India and Pakistan, and it's called Ambulocetus natans. Now, if you're still good on your Latin, you can break that down. Ambulocetus is the walking whale, and natans is who swims. This is the walking whale who swims. It is a perfect intermediate form. So what did paleontologists do? Did they say, okay, we found this guy, we're going to plug him in, game over, we found an intermediate form? Well, the answer is of course not. Paleontologists, like all scientists, are interested in a complete story. once they realized that the Indus River Valley was where this transition took place, they flocked there. And they found more specimens of this guy. But they also found another species, and then a third, and then a fourth, until finally they unearthed a whole series of transitional forms that document absolutely brilliantly how cetaceans, whales, and dolphins evolved from their terrestrial ancestors. So we have a very complete picture of this. Now, I should tell you that I took this slide from a wonderful book called Evolution, the Triumph of an Idea by Carl Zimmer, who's a science writer who writes for Scientific American and the New York Times. A couple months ago, I gave a talk like this one in Connecticut. Carl lives in Connecticut, and he came to my talk. So I was real happy that I mentioned I stole the picture from Carl, since he was in the audience. But Carl came up to me afterwards and said, Ken, thanks for giving me credit, but I have to tell you something. There's a mistake in there. I thought, oh man, what have I done now? And he said, here's the mistake. That picture is out of date. And he handed me a new review article, and he said, you said there were 6 intermediate forms between terrestrial animals and whales. That's not true anymore. It turns out there's 23. Because the explosion of paleontological data, once they understood where to dig and what geological era to look at, there was just one after another after another. And in fact, you could almost call whales the poster child for macroevolution. And Hans Twissen, who does this work at Ohio State University, has called whales exactly that, because they document evolution so brilliantly. Now, this was not the sort of thing that I testified about in the trial, since paleontology is not my field. But I want to let you know that the discovery of new fossil intermediates didn't stop with the trial. Here, for example, is an article that appeared after the trial, April last year, in that left-wing propaganda rag, the Wall Street Journal. And you can see the headline, New Discoveries Answer Big Questions in Evolutionary Theory. What were the new discoveries? Well, a book called Pandas and People, which was an intelligent design textbook that the Dover board actually purchased for their kids, said, here's what evolutionists believe. Evolutionists believe that the first tetrapods, the first 4-footed land animals, came from lobe-finned fishes. And evolutionists imagine that there are intermediate forms between these two completely different limbs, and they basically ask students to say, look at that, isn't that ridiculous? Because they don't look anything like each other. Well, the reality is, and this is what Kevin showed in the trial, is that the intermediate forms we actually have between lobe-finned fishes and the very first tetrapods are far more detailed than this little sketch would show. But what was important, and this was what the Sharon Begley's article was about in the Wall Street Journal, is that in just the last year, 2 major intermediates have been discovered on either side of Panderichthys right here. And I want to show you what these 2 are, because they turned out to be great discoveries. One of them was a nearly complete fossil called Tiktaalik. It was discovered in the Canadian Arctic. And Tiktaalik shows exactly how these lobe fins were remodeled to form the front part of the vertebrate limb. Then later in the year, just a couple months ago, a new fossil called Goganathus was discovered. It's more or less on the fish side of this. And here was a fish with a fin that actually had a radius and an ulna and the antecedents of the phalanges, the fingers. So, in just the 12 months since the Dover trial, we started out with a series of progressions showing how this limb had evolved looking like this. We found Tiktaalik on this side, and we found Goganathus on this side. In other words, every time you look around, these transitions get better and better and better in terms of their documentation. One of my colleagues who has a real knack for slogans and bumper stickers put it this way. When you get in an argument about evolution, Ken, he says, here's what you should say. What you should say is, we got the fossils, we win. End of story. Now, as I said, this is not the kind of material that I testified about, but I want to show you what I did testify about. If you've ever doubted the existence of God, I'm going to give you proof of the existence of God right now. 2 weeks before the Dover trial, Nature published the chimpanzee genome. That was a gift from God. And we had to find a way to bring this into the trial. Now, why did we want to bring this into the trial? The lead article explains why. The authors wrote, more than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley proposed that we share recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction. But the problem was, with all due respect to members of the legal profession, we had to explain this in terms that even a judge could understand. So we had to think, he's an attorney, he's a bright guy, but he's not trained in molecular biology. So if I start talking about genetic synteny or discontinuities or all this other sort of stuff, he's not going to make it. We figured out a way to explain this, and I want to show you how we did it, showing the slides we used in court. Now, we've known for a long time that we humans share common ancestors with the other great apes, gorillas, orangs, chimpanzees, and so forth. Fossil evidence, genetic evidence, even biogeography. But if we do, there's something funny about this. We humans have 46 chromosomes. The other great apes have 48. Now, what does that mean? Well, the biology students in the room will tell you that those 46 are actually 23 pairs of chromosomes, because you get 23 from mom and 23 from dad. Similarly, the great apes, those are 24 pairs. What happened? In other words, is it possible that in the lineage leading to us, a pair of chromosomes was simply lost? Well, the answer is no, it's not possible. And the reason it's not possible is because there's too much valuable genetic information in every single human pair of chromosomes. And the loss of both members of a homologous pair would be fatal. So the only possibility is that two chromosomes which were separate in other primates became fused together to form a single chromosome in us. That would drop us from 24 pairs to 23. That's a good hypothesis, but here's the cool part. It is a testable hypothesis, and that's what makes evolution different from things like creationism or intelligent design. If evolution is right in terms of common ancestry of our species, somewhere in our human genome, we have to have a fused chromosome, and we should be able to find it. We should literally be able to find the piece of Scotch tape holding those two pieces of chromosome together. Now, you might wonder, how would we know that? Excuse me. Once again, the biology students in the audience, you know how this can be done. The tips of chromosomes have special DNA sequences called telomeres, and I've colored them in here in blue. They're only found at the tips. Near the center of chromosomes are other sequences called centromeres. They're only found in the center. If two chromosomes were fused, you know what would happen? We would end up with telomere DNA sequences where they don't belong, right in the middle of the chromosome. We'd also end up with a chromosome that has two centromeres. So all we have to do is to scan our genome and see, do we have a chromosome that has telomeres in the center and has two centromeres? If we don't have that, then evolution, in terms of common descent for our species, could be falsified. But if we do, it's a powerful argument in favor of evolution. Well, do we have a chromosome like that? The answer is, as you can see, we do. And it's called chromosome number 2. And I'll read to you from the scientific paper. Chromosome 2 is unique to our lineage. It emerged as a result of the head-to-head fusion of two chromosomes, still separate in other primates. If you haven't followed how much we know about our own genome, this may surprise you. The precise fusion site is between bases 114,455,823 and 114,455,838. That's where the Scotch tape is, ladies and gentlemen. Do we have telomeres? Yes, we do. Do we have centromeres? And you can read it here. Yes. The centromeres in human chromosome number 2 correspond to chimpanzee chromosome centromeres 12 and 13. So clearly they resulted from a fusion of these. Is there any way that you can explain these facts, and they are facts, by postulating the de novo design or creation of our species by an intelligent designer? The answer is absolutely positively not, unless you want to say that the intelligent designer rigged chromosome 2 just to play a little joke on us and to fool us into thinking that we evolved. And frankly, if you're willing to believe in an all-powerful being who plays jokes, well, then it's going to be very hard to do science of any sort. There is absolutely no question that this nails the case that we show common descent with these particular species. Now, the other thing that happened in the Dover trial is that it exposed intelligent design as a religious doctrine pretending to be science. Now, how did we do this? This is the statement that the Dover Board of Education asked teachers to read to students. And when you scan through this, you'll see nothing about God, nothing about Genesis, nothing about the Bible. Therefore, they said, therefore, it's not religious. So how did we show that this was a religious statement? The answer is unbelievably simple. There are 3 expert witnesses for the other side of the case. All we had to do was put them on the stand and say, fellas, tell us what you think. And they did. Here's Michael Behe, who is a biochemist from Lehigh University. Mike said it is implausible that the designer is a natural entity. That means he's supernatural. Scott Minich said that for intelligent design to count as science, we got to change the ground rules of science so that supernatural forces can be considered. Thank you very much, Dr. Minich. And Steve Fuller said the whole project of ID is to change science to include the supernatural. They established that this was a religious idea. Now, when I was on the stand, they knew this testimony was coming. And they said, you know, Dr. Miller, you claim to be a religious person. And I said, yeah. And they said, well, you know, why would you have a problem with the supernatural? And I said, religious person? Heck, I'm a Boston Red Sox fan. Of course I believe in the supernatural. I can't think of any explanation for 2004 that doesn't involve the supernatural. And I said, you'd be surprised how many people in my part of the country think that in 2004 God was just really tired of George Steinbrenner and wanted to teach him a lesson. And you know what? That might be true. That could be the correct explanation. But it's not testable, and therefore it's not science. Saying that supernatural is not science is not the same thing as being against the supernatural, and that was the point. Now, I have to tell you, though, as useful as that testimony was, I want to show you what nailed this case. This is an intelligent design textbook, which the Dover Board bought for their kids in Pennsylvania. It's called Of Pandas and People. Now, when you open this textbook and you read, for example, the definition of intelligent design, it sounds very scientific. Intelligent design means various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency. Distinctive features already intact, fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, blah, blah, blah. Sounds very scientific. Before the trial started, our attorneys subpoenaed the publishers of this book, and they asked them to send us old versions of this, titles published under a different name, page proofs, editorial correspondence. I didn't think they'd get anything. Lawyers called me up and said, Ken, we got 2 boxes of stuff, and you'll never believe what's in them. And they told me, and I couldn't believe it. All I could think of was, you know, didn't these guys learn anything from the Nixon administration? You got to burn this stuff. You can't leave it around. Well, it turns out they had published this book earlier, a couple years earlier, under a different title. That's why we didn't know about it. It was called Biology and Origins. And Biology and Origins matched up with Pandas and People paragraph for paragraph, except there were subtle little changes. Look at this. Creation means various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent creator. It's the same paragraph. And all these guys did was to take the word creator, cross it out, and paste designer on top of it. It turns out this paragraph is not the only example. Barbara Forrest from Louisiana, one of our expert witnesses, went through all of these things, and she counted how many times the early versions mentioned creation, that's in red, and how many times they mentioned design, that's in blue. Early versions, all about creation, nothing about design. Watch this. All of a sudden, now you look at that, I'm an empirical scientist. That's really strong data. What's the data that what would I conclude from that? Well, here's what I would conclude. Something remarkable happened in 1987. Now, you look like a pretty bright group. What happened in 87? Arkansas is close. It's actually, in the spirit of what I'm asking, that's the right answer. It was actually a Louisiana case. And it was a Louisiana case called Edwards versus Aguillard. This is a timeline of litigation on the theory of evolution. Edwards versus Aguillard, 1987, branded creation science as a religious doctrine. So you know what happened? These guys had this book about creationism. Suddenly the Supreme Court says that's religious. So they get together and they say, we can't call this creation science anymore. What are we going to call it? And somebody says, intelligent design. That is how intelligent design was born. They took the textbooks, they fired up Microsoft Word, they did a find and replace, and suddenly the creator became a designer and creation became intelligent design. Anybody who tells you that intelligent design is somehow fundamentally different from creationism, remind them on how this so-called intelligent design textbook came about. So this, again, closed the case in that respect. Now, one of the things that I'm always struck by whenever I talk about evolution is no matter how strong a case I try to make for evolution, I find people shaking their heads. And they shake their heads because they say, you know, my problem with evolution is not that it's wrong. It's not that you don't have the fossils. It's not that you don't have the genes. You got all that stuff. But it is that evolution is hostile to faith, that it is anti-religious. Now, why do they say that? They say that in part because portraying evolution as anti-religious is part and parcel of the so-called wedge strategy articulated by Philip Johnson. He's one of yours. He's from Cal Berkeley, who is the godfather of the intelligent design movement. He calls his strategy for intelligent design the wedge. And here's what Phil said at a conference. The objective of the ID strategy is to convince people that Darwinism is inherently atheistic. That'll shift the debate from creation versus evolution to the existence of God versus the non-existence of God. Then we can introduce people to the truth of the Bible, the question of sin, and finally introduce them to Jesus. If you ever wanted a testament to the religious motivation of this movement, you have it right there in the words of Philip Johnson. Now, I have to say that this strategy has been brilliantly successful. It is almost impossible to have a conversation about evolution that doesn't immediately change to God. And I want to show you how quickly this occurs by showing you an interview on one of those educational channels that I know you all watch to improve your mind. And I want you to watch this and watch how quickly the question of evolution becomes a question of religion. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did doing it. I have to tell you, nothing I've ever done in my entire scientific career has ever come close to gaining the credibility with my students that 6 minutes on the Colbert Report did. So it was an extraordinary thing. But look how quickly, and I did edit that for the sake of time, but look how quickly that question came, what about God? And I think that's an important issue. It's a fact that we really don't have a shortage of anti-religious statements made by leading scientists. Here, for example, is what David Hull wrote in Nature magazine a few years ago. And what he said was, whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory and natural history may be like, he's not the Protestant God of waste not, want not. He's not a loving God who cares about his productions. He isn't even the awful God portrayed in the book of Job. The God of the Galapagos, the God of evolution, is careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. He certainly is not the sort of God to whom anyone would be inclined to pray. In short, if God exists, evolution tells us he's a very nasty fellow. Now, this is not the only sort of thing you can see. Richard Dawkins, who, for my money, is probably the best and the most incisive writer on evolutionary theory in the planet. I recommend Dawkins' books to anyone. Has said, the universe we observe, informed by evolution, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That's what science, according to Dawkins, tells us about the universe. And in just the last year or so, Dawkins and a host of other thinkers, people like Daniel Dennett, have published a whole series of books attacking religion as being a plague on mankind, anti-scientific superstition, and generally bad for the human species on this planet. Dawkins I like in particular because of its subtle title, The God Delusion. And there's absolutely no doubt about what Dawkins is saying. But here's the question, and Richard is certainly entitled to have these viewpoints. And here's the question. Are these really scientific viewpoints? These things have an assertion built into them, these statements, and that is that science alone can lead us to ultimate truth regarding the purpose of existence. And the truth that science leads us to, of course, is that existence does not have a purpose. Now, you know that might be true, but the reality is that statements like that are philosophical, not scientific in nature. Now, philosophical doesn't mean wrong. Philosophical means not testable by the methods of science. And a statement like the one that you saw on the previous slide is no more a scientific statement than a faith-based assertion that I or somebody else might make about the wonderful nature of existence. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Here's Richard Dawkins' statement again, that the universe has exactly the properties we should observe if all of these things were true. Well, there are a lot of people in science who disagree with Dawkins, and I'll give you a couple of examples. John Haught, who's a theologian who writes about science, Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project, Theodosius Dobzhansky, probably the most distinguished evolutionary theoretician of the 20th century, and also Francisco Ayala, a very distinguished evolutionary and population geneticist. And you know what these people might say to counter to Dawkins? They wouldn't agree. None of them would agree with what Dawkins has written here. You know what they might say? They might say something like this. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom the design of a provident and purposeful God intent upon a fruitful and dynamic world and committed to a promise of freedom that makes genuine love possible. Now, do I believe that? Yes, I do. Is that a scientific statement? No, it is not. But neither is Dawkins a scientific statement. And I think that is the key way to understand these, and that is the pathway to this. Now, pathway to understanding and resolving the issues between science and religion. Many of you may know that the New York Times Magazine, exactly a month ago, carried a really, I think, splendid and provocative article called Why Do We Believe? And look at the premise of the article from the very beginning. In the world of evolutionary biology, the question is not whether God exists, but why we believe in him. Is belief a helpful adaptation or an evolutionary accident? In other words, maybe evolution has primed us to believe in God. For example, and this goes on and makes the logical point, if scientists are able to explain God as an evolutionary artifact, what then? Is explaining the reason for religion the same thing as explaining it away? In short, are we hardwired to believe in God? And therefore, if we are, does that mean religion is invalid? Now, I expected not to like this article, but as it turns out, I liked it a great deal. The reason I liked it a great deal is because the author of the article realized that there is an element to this that goes the other way. And towards the end of the article, what the author did was to quote Justin Barrett, who is someone who has worked very, very hard in the field of evolutionary psychology, trying to explain the nature of the religious impulse in evolutionary terms. And even though he's one of the leaders in the field, he also turns out to be a Christian. And you can see why would his faith, at first blush, his faith seems confusing. How does his view of God as a byproduct of mental architecture coexist with Christianity? And I love what he said here. Why wouldn't God have designed us in such a way as to find belief in divinity quite natural? Having a scientific explanation for a mental phenomenon doesn't mean we should stop believing them. Suppose science produces a convincing account for why I think my wife loves me. Should I then stop believing that she does? And I think that's an extraordinary way to put it. A supreme being who would have used evolution to create our bodies would likely have used evolution to create our minds, and therefore would have given us the capacity for belief. That's not a slam dunk, but it certainly makes good sense to me and to many other people. I think the key question for all of us is really very simple, and that is whether or not science carries us as deeply into the mystery of life as we truly wish to go. Many people would say, yes, science tells me everything I want to know about life. But many people of faith would say, no, I don't think so. I need a further explanation. Now, this is not a rejection of science, but rather a recognition of its limitations. I'm a scientist. I've spent my entire life in science, and I'm going to continue to do that for as long as I'm able. I don't reject science at all. But I also recognize that science has its limitations. There are certain questions, at least in my life, and perhaps in yours, that science can inform, but it cannot provide ultimate answers to. And this issue, that science does not tell us everything we wish to know about life, I think is the basis upon which many people, and many people who respect and participate in science, can build faith. Now, I'm often told by people, I don't think so. I think the God of the Bible is an anti-evolutionary God. But, you know, in the Abrahamic or the Western tradition, I don't think that's true at all. We tend to think of God as a being who makes all things new. And it's always struck me that a God like that wouldn't have imprinted an inflexible order into the living world, made it one way and said it can never change. And nor is he one who could have only created in this very simple and direct way that we manage creation. And I think I have scriptural backup for that. This is a quotation from Isaiah, one of my favorite books in the Bible. If you know Isaiah, you know that periodically God gets mad at Isaiah and he lets him have it. And this is one of the points where he's just run out of patience with Isaiah. And he says, look, my thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. God is telling Isaiah, I don't work on your level. Don't psych me out. Don't tell me how I have to do things to accomplish my ways. I'm working on a whole different level. So the claim that the God that someone thinks they know could only have created or carried out his purpose in a certain way, Isaiah is right here telling you that's not the case. God is working on a different level. Now, a point of priority. Obviously, I don't think that evolution should be used to draw anti-religious conclusions. But I'm not the first person to say that. This guy said it, and you probably all have heard of him. Near the end of a book, he said, I don't see any reason why the views in my book should shock anybody. I've gradually learned by writing to someone else that he has learned to see that it's just as noble a conception of the deity to believe that he created a few original forms capable of self-development into other and needful forms as to believe that he required a fresh act of creation to supply the voids caused by the actions of his laws. That guy, of course, was Charles Darwin, and those words come from The Origin of Species. Now, does this mean that a religious person has to think that the Bible should be read as a scientific text? Well, the answer is of course not. But once again, I want to let you know I'm not the first person to say that. I want to show you a remarkable quotation from St. Augustine, written in 411 AD. And I like to choose Augustine because he was one of the earliest and the most prolific of the early Christian writers, and also because Augustine is generally accepted by everybody in the Christian tradition, Orthodox, Protestant, Catholic, pretty much everybody. He wrote a book called On the Literal Meaning of Genesis. And you can read Augustine's words for yourself. When you read them, I'm going to translate them on the fly into what I think is 21st century English. I'll tell you what I think Augustine is saying. Even a non-believer can study geology, astronomy, zoology, botany, and other scientific fields, and can gain scientific knowledge from observation and experiment. Now, the worst thing that could happen would be for a non-believer to hear a Christian, presumably explaining the Bible, talking nonsense on these scientific topics. That's the worst thing that could happen. And we have to do everything we can to prevent the embarrassment in which non-believers show up scientific ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. Look at what Augustine is doing. He's warning his followers, don't open Scripture and pretend that you can do astronomy or biology by reading Scripture, because if you're wrong, the non-believer will disregard the real message of Scripture, which is the message of salvation. And that would be a tragedy. So Augustine stands foursquare behind the idea that science has to be done on its own terms. Now, when I lecture in front of departments of biology and other scientists, every now and then they like me right up until I quote from Isaiah and I show Augustine, and then they get a little nervous, they start to squirm a little bit, and they wonder, what kind of science would you get if you followed the precepts of some weird 5th century mystic like Augustine? And that's a painting of Augustine right up there. And I think that's a pretty good question. So I'd like to answer that with an example. What kind of science would you get if you followed Augustinian precepts? Well, I want to show you here a person who became a priest in an order founded according to the precepts of St. Augustine. He did very well in the priesthood. He was a very religious guy, and he became the abbot of the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Brunn, in what is now the Czech Republic. He was a brilliant person. He was sent to the University of Vienna to study natural history and natural theology, and then he came back and he rose to the level of abbot. Now, at one point in his life, he became interested in something that today we would call a scientific question. He was really interested in how plants pass their characteristics along from one generation to another. So how did he get his answer? Did he read Scripture? Well, we know he did. He had to read it every day for what's called the Roman office. Did he pray? Well, we know he prayed. He led the monastery in prayer. But when the time came to answer a scientific question, you want to know what he did? He went out into the garden and he did experiments. And that Augustinian monk was Gregor Mendel, the founder of the modern science of genetics. So what kind of science do you get if you follow Augustinian precepts? The answer is you get damn good science, you get genetics. And I think that is as profound a statement as one can make about the compatibility of science with religion. Dogma, not faith, is the barrier to scientific inquiry. And this was the title of a letter to the editor, letter to Nature, just a few weeks ago. And the letter writer pointed out that Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the most distinguished evolutionary biologists of the 20th century, the guy who coined this wonderful statement, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And everybody I know in biology agrees with that. Wrote in the same article, I am a creationist and an evolutionist because evolution is God's or nature's method of creation. He argued that the Creator has created the living world not by caprice, supernatural fiat, or I would add by intelligent design, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. And this is the way in which Dobzhansky described it. Now, a more contemporary scientist, Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project, has written, I think, a marvelous book that came out last year called The Language of God. Dr. Collins is a very devout evangelical Christian. He's also an absolutely top-notch molecular biologist and an absolute uncompromising evolutionist. And you will discover that if you read his book. But nonetheless, he finds room for Christian faith within what we understand about evolution and what we understand about molecular biology. As if to drive this point home, I want to show you a little challenge that Mike McEwen, a geneticist friend of mine at Brown, tossed my way a couple months ago. Mike sent me this paragraph, and he said, Ken, I want you to guess who wrote this. I won't read the whole thing to you, but I'll skim through it. 15 billion years ago, Big Bang, stars and galaxies, 10 billion. Our Earth, 4.5 billion years. Little consensus about the first microscopic life to become, little consensus about the origin of microscopic life on Earth, but general agreement, first organism dwelled on this planet about 3.5 billion years ago. Since it has been demonstrated that all living organisms on Earth are genetically related, it is virtually certain that all living organisms have descended from this first organism. Got any idea who wrote that? That's as good a one-paragraph summary of the natural history of our universe as I've ever seen. This guy wrote it. At the time, his name was Joseph Ratzinger. He's now more commonly known as Pope Benedict XVI. And to be fair, he didn't actually write it. He chaired a committee called the International Theological Commission, and he signed off on the committee's report. So he certainly approved of it. This was published by the Vatican in 2004. And I want to go on. This is paragraph 63. I want to show you paragraph 69, which is really significant. Because it turns out that Benedict realized that in the United States right now, we're having a big argument about evolution. And he said this debate requires theological comment. Why? Because it involves a misunderstanding of the nature of divine causality. And here's what he says. Many neo-Darwinian scientists, this would be people who in his terminology think that science proves that there is no God, as well as some of their critics, these would be the intelligent design guys, conclude that if evolution is a radically contingent material process driven by natural selection and random genetic variation, there's no place in it for divine providential causality. In other words, for God. But he says, wait a minute. According to our understanding of divine causality, true contingency, that's randomness, in the created order is not incompatible with a purposeful divine providence. Thus, even the outcome of a truly contingent natural process, that's what evolution is, can nonetheless fall within God's providential plan for creation. And I think he said it there, and he said it extremely well. If any of you are interested in what I would call really hardcore theology, I'd recommend a couple of splendid books written by Jack Haught, who's a theologian at Georgetown, and I love the way Jack put it in this book, God After Darwin. A world in evolution doesn't follow a strict plan, but still gets its being, value, and meaning by God's vision for it. The God of evolution doesn't fix things in advance or hoard selfishly the joy of creating. Instead, that God shares with all creatures their own openness to an indeterminate future. Now, you want to know who put it even better? And I want to show this for political as well as for scientific reasons. Charles Krauthammer. Charles Krauthammer, if you don't know him, is one of the most conservative columnists on the Washington Post. After the Dover trial ended, Krauthammer wrote a column called Phony Theory, False Conflict. And I love the way that Krauthammer put this, which is why he's a professional columnist. How ridiculous to make evolution the enemy of God. What could be more elegant, more simple, more brilliant, more economical, more creative, indeed more divine than a planet with millions of life forms, each distinct and yet interactive, all ultimately derived from accumulated variations in a single double-stranded molecule pliable and fecund enough to give us mollusks and mice, Newton and Einstein, even if it also gave us the Kansas Board of Education. And indeed, I think Krauthammer put it exactly right. But what's the best way to talk about evolution? One of the problems that many people have with evolution is they find it to be a depressing vision. They find the notion that they are just part of the animal kingdom to be demeaning. They don't like what it tells them about their lives. Well, I don't feel that way at all, and a lot of other people don't feel that way either. And I think the person who said it best was the person who kept this notebook. And some of you may recognize this sketch. It was made in 1837. It's a long time ago. And it's very rare in the history of science that you can point to a single page in somebody's notebook and you can say, you know what, right there on that page is one of the great ideas in human history. But right there on that page is one of the great ideas. It says, I think, and then you see a sketch of a sort that no one else had ever done before. And what this person wrote at the end of a famous book that you all heard of is not that he found evolution to be depressing or demeaning. He said, on the contrary, I think there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. That's the concluding sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And you know what? I think those are words to live by. Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Appreciate that.
You want to take any questions?
Sure.
Or?
Thank you very much. I'd be very happy to take questions. Always tough to be the first. Be bold. Yes, ma'am.
In getting the public to respond like they did in Kansas to replace what do you think are key activities that people can engage in to make that happen?
I'm not sure everybody heard that, so I'll repeat questions because I'm the guy with the microphone. The question was, in getting the public to respond the way that they did in Kansas, what are some of the key activities to get people involved? Well, I think the first thing was to mobilize the scientific, the educational, and the professional communities in Kansas. The statewide Kansas Teachers Association really mounted a major effort to get the word out that this was an important election. The scientific community, the state universities in Kansas stood together in a way that nobody in the state had ever seen before. An impromptu organization had been formed a few years earlier called Kansas Citizens for Science that served as an overall clearinghouse. And what they did was that they did some practical politics. I come from Massachusetts, and therefore I understand Kansas. That might sound like a very strange thing to say, but Massachusetts, you see, is a one-party state. So is Kansas. Now, it happens to be a different party, but it is still a one-party state. And that means if you want to unseat an incumbent, you got to do it in the primaries. Because, you know, in Massachusetts, it's all Democrats. You want to unseat somebody, you got to run against them in the Democratic primary. In Kansas, you got to put your strong candidate up in the Republican primary. So they played practical politics. They recruited good, strong candidates, and they kept the issue focused on scientific integrity and the future of the state of Kansas. That, coupled with the fact that, quite frankly, and I'm going to criticize by implication myself and almost everybody else here, getting the university communities in Kansas to actually pay attention to a public issue was a major thing. Most of us in universities figure, the voters are a bunch of idiots. Who cares? It's state government. That's the reason we put the capital in Topeka. Nobody will pay attention to it and that sort of stuff. But realizing that this is an important public issue and getting the university community to get out and play practical, hardball politics, I think that really was the key. Other questions? Yes, sir.
On one of your slides, you had the pie chart of the
Yeah.
big proportion of people who still believe in creationism.
Yeah.
Against evolution.
Yeah.
Believe it couldn't happen. How is there anything that's going to turn the tide to change that, or is that just something we're stuck with and it's just been that way for as long as we can remember it?
Yeah, well, depending on how you ask the question. Generally, between 40 and 55% of Americans will say they reject evolution. They say they don't believe this stuff. If you don't involve human beings, and you just talk about, dinosaurs and all sorts of other stuff, you can get 55, 60% of the people to accept evolution. Once you put human beings in it, that acceptance drops to 35 or 40%. So how do we educate the general public? Well, I think the answer is that we in the scientific community have to do a much better job. I mean, quite frankly, I think we suck at popularizing science. There are a couple of reasons for that. Science is such a wonderful activity. Most of us would rather just do it and be left alone and not worry about taking our case to the public. But, and also, and this is, I think, extremely important, there almost is an attitude in the scientific community that people who popularize science, who explain it to the general public, are engaged in some sort of a trivial pursuit. They aren't real scientists anymore. There were people who looked down their noses at Stephen Jay Gould and Carl Sagan and people like that because they engaged in scientific popularization. All of us in the scientific community ought to find people like that and thank them, because in a democracy like ours, the continued prosperity of science depends upon public support. So I think the first thing is the scientific community has to change its attitude towards what it does and towards popularizers of science. The second thing is, I don't think that we have to worry about opinion polls in terms of how many Americans this, that, the other thing. I think that what we have to concentrate on really are practical politics. In other words, we have to try to make sure that elected officials understand the nature of science and the importance of science, and they place an appropriate priority on it in public policy. That means that people in the scientific and educational communities have to roll up their sleeves and get involved in electoral politics. Sir.
You've ranged over quite a bit of territory tonight, from the science to the
Yeah.
theological. It occurs to me that, as you pointed out, some of the arguments that you've made are philosophical in nature.
Sure.
And so my question is, apart from the narrow question of creationism and evolution in the Kansas School Board, do you have any thoughts about what kind of education we ought to be offering regarding the issue of evolution in its scientific aspects and other aspects as well?
That's a very good question, and I think the right way to teach evolution is to teach the science. And what I mean by that is the opponents of evolution would like to pretend that there's a controversy about evolution, and they like to have that controversy in the classroom. And as an example of this, for example, the Discovery Institute, which is based in Seattle, Washington, has this list where they say they found 600 or 700 scientists who have signed a statement of dissent from Darwinism. And that means they'd like to let people know that there is a genuine scientific controversy, bring that into the classroom. Well, a couple weeks ago, I got the list, and I alphabetized the names. A lot of the arguments they make are based on biochemistry and cell and molecular biology. Well, I thought that's interesting. So I took the list and I ran it against the membership list of the 11,000 members of the American Society for Cell Biology and the 11,700 members of the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. On that list, from 11,700 in ASBMB, there were 3 signers. From ASCB, there were 4. So that means out of nearly 23,000 scientists in these organizations, 7 had signed this statement. And of the 7, 2 of them were senior fellows of the Discovery Institute who have PhDs in the particular field. Now, this amounts to not 1% of the scientific organization, not even 1/10 of 1%, but rather 3/10,000ths of 1%. And what that tells you is that there's really no support within this in the scientific community. So how do you teach evolution? A, you don't do students a service by pretending that there's a phony controversy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you teach evolution like any other thing in science. Sometimes people will say, well, you shouldn't teach evolution dogmatically. Of course not. You shouldn't teach organic chemistry dogmatically. You shouldn't teach ecology dogmatically. Dogma has no place in science. I tell my students when I'm training my teaching assistants, there's only one dogma in science, and that is that science has no dogma. And all science has to be taught this way. And I think the right way to teach evolution is to lay out the evidence for the age of the Earth, the natural history of this planet, the ability of natural organisms to basically produce new combinations of genetic material and the ability of natural selection to act on those combinations. And I think if you do it that way, and you don't do it with a lot of philosophical baggage, and you don't do it dogmatically, it can work and it can work well. Yes, sir. Well, that's a very good question, and it's a question that was asked in that article in the New York Times. Exactly right. And I would say, trying to be fair to the individuals who raised this argument, I would go back to a wonderful book written by E.O. Wilson, great evolutionary biologist at Harvard, called On Human Nature. And I think this book must have been published 30 years ago. And in this book, Ed Wilson argued, among other things, that he could explain religion in evolutionary terms. And he could explain it by saying the following: the religious impulse is actually an impulse in which we tend to coalesce around myth, ritual, in groups with common symbols, and to have a sense of reverence or a sense of the holy. All human beings in all cultures on this planet are capable of doing this. You even see this coalescence around myth and ritual in societies that were avowedly atheist. If you observe the May Day parades in Red Square in the old Soviet Union, you would see behaviors and patterns that any sociologist would identify as religious. So Wilson would say that evolution produced the capacity, produced the religious impulse for a very simple reason. Groups of individuals who could coalesce around myth and ritual were much more effective at raising food, raising children, and making war than groups of individuals who were not. And therefore, these traits became common in us, and that explains religion. I tend to agree with that, and I think that's generally true. But the deeper question is, having explained religion, have you explained religion away? And the reason for that is, if you can say the religious impulse arises because of our evolutionary heritage, you know what else arises because of our evolutionary heritage? Reason, science, mathematics. Our evolutionary heritage also produces all of these. I've had a off-and-on conversation over the years with my friend Steven Pinker, who's a very well-known author and a writer on evolutionary psychology, previously at MIT, now at Harvard. And Steve has said, Ken, the reason you go to church on Sunday is because evolution put a God module in your brain. And it is, he calls it the God module. And this predisposes people towards religion, and that's the reason you're willing to believe all this nonsense and go to church and so forth and so on. And I said, well, Steve, that might be true. But what you have to appreciate is that evolution also put a science module in our brain. There's a reason why we find rational scientific explanations so compelling and so convincing. And I think evolution had something to do with that as well. Now, having said that, does that mean we should abandon science because our scientific impulse is the product of our evolutionary sense? The answer is, of course not. I think we have to use all the facilities we've been given. We have to appreciate the fact that we are the product of evolution. And if you come down on the side of a supreme being, you would easily say that the evolutionary process, which is made possible by the conditions of the universe in which we live, also endowed us with the capacity to appreciate and to know a supreme being. That means that explaining the source of the religious impulse doesn't explain religion away. In other words, if you wish to explain religion away, you've got more work to do. Other questions? Yeah.
Kendall, I'd like to thank you for coming here, and also the Newman Center for trying to get you here for so long. It starkly contrasts with some of the other speakers that have been invited to Davis for the past years, a lot of anti-evolutionists. So my question for you is, as you've spoken a lot about this topic, and as the anti-evolutionists, the intelligent designers speak about it, a lot of them say that, that you believe that there's a God that created the universe and then ended up, with all the Kansas Board of Education and other things. That therefore you're sort of on their side because they sort of, in a wishy-washy way, say that somewhere, somehow, something was designed, and that's the core of the argument. I was wondering if you could speak
Yeah, in other words, why am I not an intelligent design person? Yeah, okay. Well, the answer is actually pretty simple, okay? And that is, well, let's see, what's the right way to put this? I do think that there is a design to life, and that design is called evolution. And when one says design, one has to be very careful, because if I had to give a prize for the best PR term that has been cooked up in the last half century to fight evolution, I'd give that prize to intelligent design, hands down. And the reason for that is theists, people who believe in God of any sort, by definition, believe that there is what you might call an intelligent design to the universe, to existence. And by that definition, any person who is a theist, whether they happen to be a Southern Baptist or a Buddhist, in a sense, is an intelligent design person, because they see intelligence to existence, and that intelligence has to come from somewhere. The advocates of intelligent design would like to say, therefore, that means you're on our side. In reality, and this is something I often try to explain to them, I'm not sure they quite get it. I actually think that the intelligent design of the universe is even better than they think it is. And the reason for that is they think there's a creator. I'm sorry, they don't use that word. I think they all go through like in a little boot camp where every time the word creation is uttered, a low voltage electric shock goes through them. And they say designer. So they think there's a designer to the universe, but they don't think the designer is very good. And the reason for that is the universe, as they see it, as the product of this designer, is not designed well enough to bring life into existence or to produce an evolutionary process that could give rise to intelligent, self-aware beings like you and me. I think it is. I think the universe is well enough designed to develop an evolutionary process and give rise to everything we see on this planet, including you, me, and maybe even Bill O'Reilly, as I said, and that sort of stuff. So, in a sense, you could always say, if you wanted to play loose with words, that I'm more of an intelligent design person than they are, because I have, as I said, a higher opinion of that designer. But in reality, when you look at the specific statements that they talk about evolution, but they talk about intelligent design, they aren't talking about an overall confluence of cosmic factors, fundamental constants that makes life possible, that makes intelligence possible, and so forth. They're saying what they're talking about is something that is properly called special creation. They are saying that supernatural intervention is required over and over and over and over again to produce anything that we would recognize as a new evolutionary novelty, a new biochemical pathway, or a new organism like us. That makes them, and I'm sorry to put it this way, that makes them creationists. Good old-fashioned creationists in every sense of the word. There are an awful lot of people who profess a belief in God, but can nonetheless respect fully what science has told us about the origins of our universe, the origins of our solar system and planet, and the origins of life on Earth. And I think that's the big distinction. Yeah, way in back, all the way back.
I just had a question for you about your views on...
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, but there was somebody way in back. Go ahead. That's okay. Don't worry. I'll get to him next, and then I think we'll have to stop. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to ask you about your views on souls, especially as regards the whole evolutionary process.
Yeah.
Some people believe that God is still the soul in human beings at some point in the evolutionary process. So what are your views on that?
Yeah, well, it's funny you should ask that question. When I published that book of mine, Finding Darwin's God, about 2 weeks after it came out, I got an invitation to deliver a seminar in front of the philosophy department at Providence College. This is just across town from where Brown is. It's a Dominican college, so it's a Catholic college. But it didn't sound much like an invitation. It sounded more like a summons. And when I went there, I gave a little seminar, and the first question was, what about the process of ensoulment? And I just scratched my head. I'm sorry, I'm just a dumb biologist. I never heard that word before. What are you talking about? And that person then explained exactly the question that you just asked. And I said, look, as a biologist, I have a simple answer. The soul is not a scientific concept. Therefore, I have nothing to say about it as a biologist. And tonight, I have nothing to say about it as a biologist. What many people are interested in is a view of sort of a combination of biological and theological natural history. And they'd like to know If you believe in the concept of the soul, first of all, what is it? Again, as a biologist, I have nothing to say. And when did the soul come about? Did God look down at a certain point and say, you know, all these things I used to call apes, they've come along pretty far. This morning at 10:30 a.m., I'm giving them all souls. Or you know, these two right here, they're really doing well. I'm going to give them souls. I'm going to call them Adam and Eve. And the soul will then be passed on genetically. Well, how do I answer it? The answer is, I have no answer to that. Neither one of these explanations makes any sense to me. But let me go a little further. A lot of religions would teach that the soul is... I've never found a religious person who said that eggs and sperm have souls. A lot of religions would say that the soul is formed at the moment of conception. Okay, well, maybe so, maybe not. However, again, thinking biologically, we now have a fertilized zygote, one cell, divides into 2, 4, 8, whatever. Now we have a little ball of cells called a morula. It's not yet implanted. Every now and then, about one time in 120, that morula will split into 2 balls of cells, and they will then develop as separate individuals. We call them identical twins. So here's what I want to know. If the soul is formed at the moment of conception, when they split, what do? Do we say the soul goes over here, and then suddenly, hey, send us another soul? Again, and I'm not trying to make fun of the concept of the soul because I actually happen to hold that concept. I'm just trying to say that when we try to take the concept of the soul, which is a spiritual idea, and impress it upon a natural history or a biological history, I think inevitably we're going to fail because I think it is a religious concept that surpasses our understanding. So that's my way of taking your very good and very provocative question, dropping back 15 yards and punting. So I'm not going to let it go. Okay, and let's, a person way in the back in the yellow shirt, yeah.
My question is actually really kind of similar to what you were asking, but I guess I'm wondering that, you just demonstrated essentially that we're human beings are evolved from apes, the great apes. And I guess...
Now, hang on for a second. I'll let you answer the question. We didn't evolve from great apes. We didn't evolve from any organism living today. Rather, we and today's great apes share a common ancestor. But we are not descended from gorillas and chimps any more than they are descended from us. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I guess by demonstrating what you just said, doesn't that kind of imply that human beings we're not really anything too, I guess, special, right? And
Yeah, that's the problem that a lot of people have with evolution.
exactly. So in that regard, isn't that kind of in direct opposition to a lot of popular religions today?
Yeah, no, I think it is. But let me sort of explore that very briefly. About 8 or 9 years ago, I was in front of, I show up in front of boards of education a lot. I was in front of the Texas Board of Education, and they were reviewing high school textbooks for Texas. They had my book on the table. And one board member says, you know, Mr. Miller, I really resent here in this book where you say that we are descended from animals. And I said, Mr. Commissioner, we're not descended from animals. He looked at me like this, and I said, we are animals. And he said, well, I resent being called an animal. And I said, now this is about 10 years ago, so I know I'm a little out of date here. But this is what I said, well, we're using a 5-kingdom classification scheme. And if you don't want to be in the animals, I can... I can put you in with the fungi. It's up to you. But I think you're right. But I think, how would I put that in perspective? Well, it's one thing to say that we share a common ancestor with other forms of life, so we come out of this sort of animal, plant, protist fabric of life that covers this whole planet. You know what the Bible says? The Bible says, remember, man, thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return. In other words, there's already a message in Scripture that says you're nothing more than an assembly of chemicals that come out of the dust of this earth. And I don't think biology tells us anything different. The message of Scripture constantly is to be humble in the face of God, in the face of creation. If biology helps us to do that, I actually think that's a good thing. Okay.
Please join us.
Thanks again, Ken. Appreciate the opportunity.